guys, it's Rex. So today we're actually going to be reviewing The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Please excuse if you hear my rabbits or my gerbils in the background. They're kind of active today. But yeah, we will be reviewing the book. Overall, I thought it was actually a pretty good book. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. I thought it was actually a very entertaining, very educational book. I learned a lot, actually. So we're going to go through the pros and the cons of this book. We'll go through some pretty difficult topics, including things like pedophilia. The book does talk about pedophilia in regards to the Catholic Church. So if that is something that's difficult for you to hear, then you might want to click away. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with the pros of this book. I've got 3 main big pros that I think this book dealt with well. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting that Richard Dawkins decided to do was he decided to talk about, why is religion still around, particularly extremist religion? You would think that from an evolutionary aspect that religion would have gone away by now. Like, for example, religious extremists who are willing to blow themselves up or fly a plane into a building or something of that nature. Those people die, typically without reproducing first. And so whatever inside of them that made them that extremist in that manner would have died with them, right? They didn't procreate. And so after thousands of years of religious extremism, you think it would have died out by now. So why hasn't it? Why do we still see that today? So he kind of decides to compare it to the moth, okay? So it's actually a very interesting comparison. We talk about, moths are attracted to light, right? And sometimes they will even fly into a flame of a candle or fly into, we have those little bug buzzers. It's like made of it's like a light, and the moth is attracted to the light, and then it'll come into the light and get zapped and it dies, right? So why do they do that? Why are moths exhibiting this suicidal behavior? Why are they killing themselves by flying straight into a light, or into a flame for that matter? And it turns out Richard says we may be asking the wrong question. Here on page 202 is where he begins discussing this. So it's very interesting how he phrases it. It's about basically we're asking the wrong question. Moths, actually, it turns out, use the sun and the moon as a way to navigate, and sunlight and moonlight travels in a parallel line, and it goes straight. So therefore, the moth can use that light and go straight in a line and make it home safely, right? However, evolution could not have foreseen that humans were going to evolve and create artificial light sources, such as candles and light bulbs. And so, because evolution could not foresee that, the moth was unprepared for artificial light sources. And weirdly enough, it turns out artificial light sources, the light that they produce does not go in a straight line. It actually spirals, which is interesting. That's some kind of physics that I'm not very well informed on. But it's interesting that artificial light goes in a spiral. So moths will see that light, thinking it is the sun or the moon, and will follow it, hoping to be navigating in a straight line. And yet the moth goes in a circle and in a circle, because the light is circular, and ends up falling into the candle or the light and gets zapped or burned, right? So we're asking the wrong question. The question should not be, why are moths suicidal? The question should be, what is misfiring here? And it turns out that the misfiring that's happening with the moth is really its navigational system. That's what's misfiring. It's not the fact that the moth is suicidal. So in the same with religion, let's apply the same thing here. What is misfiring in humans? Instead of asking why some humans are suicidal in terms of religion, let's ask what's misfiring. And so he gives a really interesting example about what possibly could be happening here. So I like the fact that he doesn't state this as fact. He just says, hey, this is an idea that I thought of, maybe this is why. So I like that he prefaces that. But here on page 203, he says that basically when we were, living in tribes thousands of years ago, right, perhaps what was happening to us was that, you're a child, maybe you're 4 or 5 years old, and your parents say, do not leave the hut, because outside the hut there are threats, like lions and tigers and bears, oh my, right? And you're 4 or 5 years old, you never heard of a lion, but your parents say to not go outside because there could be a lion out there, right? So your parents say, so you obey them. You've never heard of a lion, you don't know why it's dangerous, but you say, okay, I'll stay inside the hut. I won't leave the hut, right? But then the kids who disobey their parents and decide to travel outside the hut anyway are the ones who get eaten by the lion. And therefore, obedience equals survival, right? And so the children that are obedient, obey their parents, do not question authority, do not question their parents. Those are the kids that grow up to have children and reproduce, and so the cycle goes on. But the kids that are disobedient are the ones that get eaten, die, and do not pass on their genes by having children later in life. So really, it's about obedience equals survival, and that's what survives. So maybe, perhaps, Richard Dawkins is saying that when, thousands of years later, now when people tell us, when your parents have told you your whole life that there is some invisible guy in the sky who cares if you touch yourself at night or some other ridiculous thing, right? You're not going to question them. You're not going to question it at all because your parents told you, your society told you, every person you've ever known has told you that. So you don't question it, right? And you don't question it because you were programmed not to question it. Thousands upon thousands of years of evolution have programmed you not to question authority because obedience equals survival. So I thought that was very, very interesting that it's more about the misfiring of an evolutionary trait rather than humans or moths being suicidal. So I thought that was super, super cool. The other thing that I really wanted to talk about is here on, looks like, 292, page 292, he talks about something else that's really interesting. This is the other pro of the book. This is my pro number 2. On page 292, he goes into a very interesting case study that was done in Israel on over 1,000 children between the ages of 8 and 14, okay? And in this, he talks about, basically he gave them, or not Richard Dawkins, the case study gave these children the story of Joshua and the city of Jericho. So this story is about just a paragraph long, so I'll give you a short little reading of it, okay? The paragraph says, Joshua said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city, and the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. Then they utterly destroyed all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and asses, with the edge of the sword. And they burned the city with fire, and all within it. Only the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Okay, so that's the little paragraph of the story of Jericho, the city of Jericho, and Joshua, and that's what they gave these kids. Okay, so these kids that are between 8 and 14, and the kids had to choose between A, total approval, B, partial approval, or C, total disapproval. And the results were pretty bad. So about 66% of these children, 8 to 14, gave total approval. And 26% gave total disapproval, with 8% in the middle at partial approval. So I'll read to you what some of these kids said, okay, as to why they totally approved, why they were like, yes, good job, Joshua, killing all those people, yeah. Okay, so why did you do that? So these kids said, well, one kid said, quote, in my opinion, Joshua and the sons of Israel acted well. And here are the reasons. God promised them this land and gave them permission to conquer. If they would not have acted in this manner or killed anyone, then there would be the danger that the sons of Israel would have assimilated among the Goyim. Goyim means non-Jewish. Okay, so that's what one kid said. Another kid said, quote, "In my opinion, Joshua was right when he did it. One reason being that God commanded him to exterminate the people so that the tribes of Israel will not be able to assimilate amongst them and learn their bad ways." End quote. Another kid said, quote, "Joshua did good because of the people who inhabited the land were of a different religion. And when Joshua killed them, he wiped their religion from the earth." End quote. Okay. So you've got 8 to 14-year-old children saying these heinous things, justifying awful, awful violence because of religion, right? So religion can make children as young as 8 years old justify the genocide of an entire city, right? So, well, you're saying, well, wait a second, Rex, what about the 26% of the kids who totally disapproved, who said it was awful, who said it was terrible? What about those kids? Well, let me read you some of their responses. Here's one of their responses. Quote, "I think it is bad, since the Arabs are impure, and if one enters in an impure land, one will also become impure and share their curse." Okay. Lovely. Okay, so here's another one. You're going to hear my rabbit in the background drinking water. Quote, "I think Joshua did not act well, as they could have spared the animals for themselves." All right, future vegan there. Okay, sure. All right. So one other kid said, quote, "I think Joshua did not act well, as he could have left the property of Jericho. If he had not destroyed the property, it would have belonged to him and the Israelites." Caring about the property, not about the people or the animals. Great, lovely. Now this is very interesting about this case study, though, is that they decided to take a different set of children in Israel and give them the exact same story of Joshua and the city of Jericho, except they changed it from Joshua to General Lin and Israel with a Chinese kingdom 3,000 years ago. Okay, so you remove religion from the equation, you're making it about a completely separate country, so you take away even patriotism, right? You have no patriotism, it's about a separate country. You take religion out of the equation, it's just about some army in China. And you get complete opposite results, okay? So the kids, now, you have only 7% who totally approved of General Lin's behavior. And you have 75% total disapproval. I mean, it's so obvious. It's not that our children are completely psychopathic. It's not that our children are completely devoid of morals. It is that when our children are brainwashed by religion, or maybe to a certain extent patriotism, they are willing to justify incredible acts of violence. And this case study really proves that point. That it's not our children that are flawed. It is what we are teaching them that is flawed. So I thought that was great of him to include that in here. It was really interesting to read. And then my last big pro for this book is quite honestly the best part of this book. It's chapter 7 of the book. And quite frankly, it is the most emotionally affecting part of the book. This chapter will affect you. If you are, in fact, a moral person, this chapter will affect you. And all this chapter does, I'm not going to read anything to you, all this chapter does is copy and paste things from the Bible, right? Or in some cases, it's got a few things in here from the Quran. And it literally just sets out all of these great stories about morals, right, that are in the Bible. And you sit there and you read it, and it's so difficult to read. There's rape in this chapter. It talks about rape because the Bible talks about rape, so it's literally just copying and pasting what the Bible's talking about. And it is very, very difficult to read. It's hard to get through. But it's important. And near the end of the chapter, he just says, a lot of people say that your morals come from the Bible, right? If you're a Christian, that I'm a good person because I get my morals from the Bible. Well, maybe you don't. Because if you could read this chapter and it disgusted you to read about that the rape that occurred, if it made you uncomfortable to read about all the awful things in this book, how would you know it's awful? If you only got your morals from the Bible, right? If all your morals came from the Bible, only from the Bible, then you would have read that passage and thought it was amazing, right? But something inside of you told you it was wrong. Something inside of you said, no, this is bad. Something inside of you made you cringe, made you feel awful, made you feel like something was wrong. Maybe you don't get your morals from the Bible. Maybe you get them from somewhere else. Who knows where they come from? But I think we all know they don't come from the Bible. So I think that's the most powerful chapter in this entire book. It really will affect you. Even if you're an atheist already, whatever, it affected me, and I'm an atheist, I've been an atheist for a long time, but it still affected me, and it will affect you. It's a really great chapter. Now, that's pretty much where the pros of all of this ends, and we're going to start talking about the negatives. So my first negative is the fact that this book is difficult to read. So I'm a college-educated woman. I can read. I promise you I can read. But almost every single paragraph has a word that I needed to Google to find the definition of. Like, it's that bad. Like, it's very, very difficult to read. And it makes it a chore, And you're missing your main audience here. So the main audience who really needs to read this book are people who are, perhaps less educated on topics of evolution. And Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist, so he could, really help somebody out in understanding evolution. And yet, he makes it so difficult to understand even the simplest of things because he decides to use what I would refer to as SAT words. Very big words that nobody uses, nobody talks like that. And I will give him the props that he is definitely a good writer, and I'm sure he thought that maybe it was artistic to go in that direction, but it just makes it difficult to read, and when reading this, I thought about putting this book down and not finishing it so many times because it was so frustrating. It really is it's an exercise in frustration. So there is, though, a free PDF of this book online, and I really, really want someone to just take the book and just replace every big word with a simpler word, and then ask Richard Dawkins permission to redistribute it, so that way more people can actually read it and it not be so frustrating or so difficult. So that's my first con. And then the last con I have of this book is on page 355. He starts talking about the physical abuse, the physical and psychological abuse that occurs in religion, particularly within the Catholic Church. So a lot of awful things have happened in the Catholic Church in regards to pedophilia. And the Vatican will not turn their priest into the authorities, will not turn them in. In fact, they will just take the priest and take him from this cathedral and then move him to a different state or perhaps a different country where this priest will now be preaching in a completely different cathedral in a completely different state or part of the country. That's all they do. They just move the priest so the priest can now start brutalizing children in another part of the country or another part of the world, whatever. It's completely awful, and it's so sickening that this occurs and that the Catholic Church literally does nothing to help it other than to spread the problem all over the place. And you would think that Richard Dawkins would say, oh, how terrible that is, and oh my God, it's awful, no, bad. Of course, he unfortunately, he doesn't. And it's very sad what he says. So I'll read to you his own words. So I'm not going to put words in his mouth. You can read his own words. I'll read it to you. He thinks, he first of all talks about his own experience. So he says, quote, all 3 of the boarding schools I attended employed teachers whose affection for small boys overstepped the bounds of propriety. That was indeed reprehensible. Nevertheless, if 50 years on they had been hounded by vigilantes or lawyers, As no better than child murderers, I should have felt obliged to come to their defense. Even as a victim of one of them, an embarrassing but otherwise harmless experience, end quote. So he's even admitting that he himself was perhaps inappropriately touched or molested by one of his teachers at the 3 boarding schools he attended, and he refers to it as an embarrassing but otherwise harmless experience. So that's his experience. If it was harmless to him, he didn't think it was that big of a deal, that's totally fine and valid because that's his experience, that's how he feels about his own abuse. But he's saying, I would have felt obliged to come to their defense. So it's one thing for you to say, okay, I was abused and it wasn't that bad. But it's a completely another thing for you to say other people are being abused and I don't think it's that bad, so I'm going to come to the defense of the abusers. What? Literally what? And then he says, let's go on. We're still on page 355. He says here, he thinks that the Catholic Church has been unfairly demonized over the issue. Unfairly demonized, Richard? Unfairly demonized? Okay, sure. Whatever you think. And then he goes on to say this. He thinks, quote, we should be aware of the remarkable power of the mind to concoct false memories, especially when abetted by unscrupulous therapists and evil lawyers, end quote. Okay, so now you think that children are just making the shit up. You think the children are just making up their own abuse, and you think that they're false memories, you say, false memories. And you think that the therapists and the lawyers want to make a bunch of money, so they convince this child that this child is being abused, so that way they can sue the Catholic Church to get money out of the Catholic Church. Sounds like a conspiracy theory to me. So that's to me kind of ridiculous. I mean, yes, there are lawyers out there that want to make money, but to say that a child is making up some false memory, I think is really ridiculous. And perhaps maybe one kid out of, I don't know, the hundreds that have come forward over the past few decades. So, okay, that to me is just ridiculous. And then he goes on to say that one time, he says, once, in the question time after a lecture in Dublin, I was asked what I thought about the widely publicized cases of sexual abuse by Catholic priests. I replied that horrible as sexual abuse no doubt was, the damage was arguably less than the long-term psychological damage inflicted by bringing the child up Catholic in the first place, end quote. So he's saying that by bringing up I will agree with him on saying that I do believe raising your child extremely religious is a form of child abuse. However, I would never compare that to physical or sexual abuse. If someone is being beaten or raped or molested, I believe that is far worse. But he disagrees with me. And he uses this woman's story to back himself up. So there's this woman who wrote to him after this, and she claims that at age 7, she was fondled twice by a priest, particularly in his car. That in his car she was molested by this priest. However, she believes that when she was raised Catholic, that one of her best friends ended up dying as a child, and her parents told her that her best friend was going to hell because her best friend was of a different religion. And so she believes that her thinking that her best friend was going to hell was a much more scarring experience than the molestation of the priest. Now again, that is her experience. That is totally fine for her. And so let me just read to you what she says. Quote, being fondled by the priest simply left the impression as yucky, while the memory of my friend going to hell was one of cold, immeasurable fear. I never lost sleep because of the priest, but I spent many a night being terrified that the people I loved would go to hell. It gave me nightmares, end quote. Now, like I said, that's her experience. It's completely valid to her. That's how she feels about her own abuse. But I don't like the fact that Richard is using her experience to justify his defense of these pedophiles. So now I will make it clear that he does say that these things are reprehensible. He says that these are awful. He said horrible as well. So I don't want to make it seem like he's completely defending pedophilia, but he also is in a way. So it's very difficult where he tries to basically have his cake and eat it too. He wants to, say that it's bad, but then defend it at the same time. So it's very confusing. It does make me uncomfortable. It's only about 2 to 3 pages in this book. I really wish it wasn't there because the rest of the book is amazing. So it kind of sucks that it's there. But I'm not boycotting Richard Dawkins. I still own many of his books. I will probably still go out and buy many of his books. But if you personally feel uncomfortable with this, there is a free PDF of the God Delusion online that you can read for free without having to give Richard Dawkins any money if it makes you feel uncomfortable. Like I said, I won't be boycotting him, but if you feel uncomfortable, then you reserve the right to do that. But overall, I think this book is really great. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. I think it's an amazing book. I think people should read it. I think you would benefit from reading it, whether you buy it or you get a free PDF. Please do read it. I think it's great. So I've decided I'm going to start uploading on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, so watch out for that. Make sure to follow all of my social medias that I will link in the description, and make sure to give this video a like and subscribe, and I will see you guys later. Okay, bye!